I mentioned lots of picks for the NBA playoffs, and the main man for that here at the network, he is our senior NBA analyst. It is John Von Tobel. He does absolutely incredible work taking a look at the association. And John, always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
What's going on, man? Sorry, I'm trying to make eye contact with you, but I've got this game on my phone. I'm trying to watch the end of OKC New Orleans, as you are too. So, but this game's been awesome, and Thunder got a bright future, man. Tell you that much.
Yep, absolutely. I'm very fortunate that the camera is pretty much sitting right in front of the TV screen with it, so I'm able to make that a little bit more tenable for those who are watching on VSiN.com. But I do think that it's going to be interesting to see what happens just moving forward with these play-in games and just into the playoffs, because something that I talked about in segment number 1 is that last year we noticed in the NBA playoffs that it was a case where if the underdogs were able to cover, they didn't just cover, they won outright. Meanwhile, if the favorites won, they were able to cover the spread. There were very few games in which the actual point spread came into play, and I feel like it could be vastly different this year, especially with how closely knit these teams in the Western Conference are, and I think that we've seen it here in the play-in tournament. I'm not sure if you agree/disagree with this, but I want to get your thoughts here because I do think that there's going to be more value on underdogs this year than we've seen the last few years in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think you're probably going down the right path. I always ask questions as to why certain things happen, right? And so I think when you go to, okay, so why wasn't the point spread as important last year? And I think we've started to see now, Greg, that, look, these teams are playing best of sevens, right? So if I'm going to lose a game, screw it. All right, I'm out now in the fourth quarter, and I'm down by like 13 with about 3 minutes left to go. I'm going to start to take the foot off the pedal. I'm going to start to loosen up my rotations. I'm going to start to get different guys in here because we got to live to fight another day because we're playing again in 48 hours. And so I think that's why you're starting to see that trend maybe pick up some steam, at least we saw last year, because, hey, man, we got 3 more games or 4 more games or whatever it is left to play in this series. We want to get ready and rested for what's going to happen next as opposed to try to fight our way back here. So I think that's why you saw that, and you might continue to see that again here in this postseason. But to your overall point, look, the West is going to be really tight, and you're looking at a bunch of these numbers already where you're talking about a bunch of game 1 spreads that are already pretty short in some series. I mean, heck, the 2 seed's only, $1.30, $1.40 favorite over the 7 seed right now in the Western Conference. It speaks to how tight this conference overall is going to play out to be. So I'd be very interested to test your theory because I do think that there's going to be a lot of volatility in the Western Conference, and whether it's going to be underdogs on a day-to-day basis or whether it's going to be underdogs in some of these series actually winning those outright or staying in within certain games, right? You can bet some of these places have like plus 1.5 games, plus 2.5 games in these series. Maybe that's a way to go too, but I think your overall point, the Western Conference wide open, might lead to some ATS volatility. I think it's pretty sound in its reasoning. It's going to be interesting to see if it tracks.
And I'm so glad that you bring up some of the derivative ways to be able to take a look at these series, because you mentioned exactly what I was going to touch upon, this Memphis Grizzlies versus LA Lakers series, when I came on and we had just seen that it was going to be the Lakers, because that's a game that went to overtime. That was actually going on during this show, the back half of that game, and the series price was posted with the Lakers being between plus 105 and plus 110. I came on and said, you're better off just betting this game to game rather than taking a series price with the LA Lakers. And I do think that taking a look at something derivative, it probably is good if you do like some of these underdogs, because I think that it is going to be an uphill task for a lot of these teams to be able to win a lot of these series, which is why you're noticing teams like the Nets at plus $6, the Hawks at plus 650. But a series like this, I think, is very good for not just game-to-game betting, but something that you were mentioning, maybe picking an exacta or maybe taking a look at some sort of a series spread.
Yeah, or an alternate spread if that's the case, for the Lakers and the Grizzlies, right? Because, I got a frog in my throat. I'm so excited about the playoffs. But when you look at it from the Lakers' perspective, Greg, like for me, I actually put a little bit because it got raised up, so I got a little bit at circa where you're sitting at right now, plus 130 for the Lakers to win the series. But also, you can look at some alternate spread lines that are out there for the series too. Lay 1.5 games with the Los Angeles Lakers. If you think that if you're going to play the series, to your point, instead of taking a cheap price, why not look to lay 1.5 games at like a plus 175 or a plus 165 for the Los Angeles Lakers if you believe they're going to win this? And by the way, it's a matchup that really works in their favor, right? Like, no Brandon Clark is massive. No Steven Adams is huge. The fact that Jaren Jackson Jr., a guy who's got so much foul trouble and issues in terms of staying on the court, it's going to be the onus on him to stay out there because he's their best front court defender and arguably their best defender, period. Like, he's going to have such a load on his shoulders to stay on that floor, something he hasn't been able to do. I think the matchup works really well for the Lakers. So to your point, at plus 105, I was like, no, I'm all right. Even though I think the Lakers have a higher probability of winning the series. When the market started to move and I got plus 130, I'm in. And looking at some other different ways to do it, like a minus 1.5 games in favor of the Lakers at a high plus price is a way to go too.
And how much do you sort of take a look at recent form going into the playoffs as well? Because we both love college basketball, and that's always a big thing. A team wins their conference tournament, they're able to get on a roll, and then they're able to go through, they're able to have a nice run in the tournament. But you're able to use this, in my opinion, for this example with the Memphis Grizzlies and the LA Lakers. And no doubt with the Grizzlies, they were able to right the ship once Ja Morant returned to the fold. But this Lakers team has really been the best team in all of basketball in the Western Conference ever since the All-Star break. And them being at the 7th seed, I think is so intriguing, especially now that they are fully healthy for the first time pretty much all year.
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the Lakers, I think we have to take this run that they've been on with a slight grain of salt, to put some numbers behind what you're talking about, right? Since the trade deadline, since they revamped this roster, they're 16-7, I think was the actual record itself. They led the league in defensive rating. There's a lot of things to like. However, the same course of time, they were 22nd in half-court offensive efficiency, 16th in overall offensive efficiency, only shooting 36% from three. Like, their offense isn't perfect, and we saw that transpire in that game against Minnesota. One of the things they have going for them is they get to the free throw line like no other team in the postseason right now, and that helped them out in that fourth quarter. But this is a flawed Lakers team, and I think to your overall question, Greg, right, about recent form, for me in the NBA postseason, because it's a best-of-7 series, right, and it's not one-off games on a neutral court against different opponents each time, I don't really take recent form. Matchups really are the way to go when you're talking about NBA postseason action. Like, those become so important. Who is guarding who? How is each team handling that? How is the team then adjusting in the next game for certain matchups that did not work? I mentioned, again, let's talk about the front court issues really quickly. For Jaren Jackson Jr., if Jaren Jackson Jr., who, by the way, in his games with the Lakers this season, he played in all of them, averaged 5 personal fouls per game. If he can't stay on the floor, now all of a sudden that front court rotation is Xavier Tillman, who's 6'8" and about 225. Santi Aldama, who's like 6'10", and I think maybe 10 pounds lighter than you, Greg, right? And then David Roddy coming out of the Colorado State in the Mountain West. Like, those are really small front court options to really go out there and go to war with against a front court like LA. So I think your overall question, I balance more matchups and how those matchups are going to play out as opposed to recent form, because you can really see the chess matches play out over the course of a best-of-7.
And I think that that's such a good point that you bring up, and I want to get your thoughts on this as well, because you did mention it. It's going to be a case where there's going to be quite a bit of home court advantage, and what I've noticed is in the Western Conference, you've got one team that enters into the playoffs more than one game above 500 on the road this year. That has been the Sacramento Kings. How much do you take into account that as well? Because I do think that we aren't going to be seeing a whole bunch of 4-game sweeps or anything like that. We could see a gentleman's sweep or two, but I just take a look at this Western Conference, and with all of these teams having their struggles on the road, I do think that that is going to cause for a little bit of value if you are taking a look at more of those series spreads that you were talking about, with a lot of these series going to 6 or 7 games.
No, I agree, right? And again, talking about different ways to bet some of these series, Greg, for those of you out there watching, if you're in markets like DraftKings, FanDuel, and others, they offer total games as well. You can bet over 5.5 total games in a series, which is another way to do it too. But I think you're right. And we go back to last year in the postseason, halfway through the second round, home court was coming out to be worth about 4.5 points to the spread. So, like, home court was worth a lot in the postseason last year. And keep in mind that was on the heels of a regular season where home court only meant about 1.5 points, specifically like 1.4. This year, home court's been worth that full 3 yet again. So now we're coming into a postseason off of a regular season, which home court meant so much more for a lot of these teams. Does that mean that we're going to get an even bigger spike for some of these teams at home? And then you mentioned one of the biggest topics, the Golden State Warriors, who lost 30 games on the road, were the 3rd worst defensive road team in the NBA, now a favorite, a 74.4% implied probability that team that has to win at least one road game to win that series is going to win that series over Sacramento. I think the market's got that mispriced. I know we can get into that a little bit more, but overall, I would agree with your overall point. These home teams, I think it's going to be pretty strong for these teams playing at home like it's been all season.
And I'm so glad that you gave that nice little teaser, because I do think that we need to talk about that series on the flip side. Also, a little bit of an update, Oklahoma City Thunder, they get it done, 123 to 118. We shall see if we're able to get a price on Pelicans versus Timberwolves for that playing game for Friday, but certainly going to be hitting Warriors versus Kings with John Von Tobel next on the Greg Peterson Experience on VSiN, the Sports Betting Network. John, we were just talking about it. Got a fascinating series between the Warriors and the Sacramento Kings, and you mentioned it. This Warriors team has been pretty historically bad on the road this season, and right now we're finding them in most places right around about a minus 270, minus 275 or so favor for the series. And how do you see this one playing out? Because I do think that the Warriors should be the favorite in this series just based on their pedigree, based on who is all out there on the court, but I'm in agreement with you that you've got to have trepidation with this Warriors team in terms of being able to close this one out easily, and I could easily see this one going 6 to 7 games.
Yeah, I would agree. And it's just about the price, the probability the market says that this team is going to win this series. And I want to stress, too, and this is what I wrote about in the series preview, Greg, like the Warriors didn't go on the road and get distracted by bright lights and loud noises, right? Or it wasn't a Memphis Grizzlies situation where we learned that John Morant, his road life was maybe a little distracting for the Memphis Grizzlies, which is why they struggled on the road. This Golden State Warriors team was the third worst defensive team in the NBA on the road this season. Only Houston and San Antonio were worse than them playing defense away from home. 119.8 points per 100 possessions in non-garbage time. Half-court settings, a defensive rating of 102.9. These are just abysmal numbers defensively. So are the Warriors better than those numbers? Sure. I think we know that they can be better. But the problem is I don't know how much better they're going to be, especially if we don't know what the workload is going to be like for Andrew Wiggins. If he is going to be back at the beginning of this series, Steve Kerr has already said out there, there's quotes about it, that he doesn't want to put a full workload on him right away in terms of playoff basketball. And this is the best offense in the NBA. So I think all of these things put together do lead to a series that is going to be a little bit more competitive. And you go back and watch those games that they played, Greg. Keep in mind, they played 3 games before November 13th. Their last game came at the end of the regular season where the Kings had nothing to play for, didn't play anybody. But they went, the Kings, to Golden State, where they've been the most consistent. They lost both of those games by a single possession and then won the game back home. I don't think that this is going to be some walkover for the Golden State Warriors. This is a Kings team that could beat guys off dribble penetration. When you go back and watch, Klay Thompson was getting beat off dribble penetration. And the Warriors, remember, when you go to their bench lineups, we're talking about Steph Curry, Jordan Poole, Dante DiVincenzo. These are not lockdown defenders. They're going to be on the floor at the same time. Greg, in their game in Sacramento, for example, Steve Kerr regularly busted out his zone defense because he can't trust his on-ball defenders, and they still lost that game. So I would very much caution anybody that thinks this Warriors team is, to use the cliche, right? Flip the switch, come in, win this thing in 4 or 5, and get out of here. This is a competitive Sacramento Kings team. I agree with your overall premise. Should the Warriors be favored? Yes. I was expecting maybe minus 150, not minus 290. And I think when you're looking at that, you can get into the other markets to play it, but there's value in looking at Sacramento in any which way, whether it's over in the total games of the series, whether it's plus 1.5 or 2.5 games in the series. I just think that the probability is too high here on the Warriors.
Yeah, it's been one of the most remarkable things I've seen. To use a baseball reference, it's been the equivalent of the Colorado Rockies when they're so good at home, they can't win a game to save their lives on the road. That's been the Golden State Warriors this year. So that I do think is interesting. I will say one thing about the Warriors. Under Steve Kerr, they've won at least one road game, I believe, in every series that he's coached in. So there is that experience, but still, during the regular season, they were winning more than, 10 road games. So there's that as well. And we are now getting an opener for the game that just went final. Oklahoma City Thunder, they closed it out against the Pelicans. They're able to win outright as an underdog. And now they're going to be finding themselves in a game with a relatively similar line. With the Minnesota Timberwolves seeing this on DraftKings right now, they're opening up as a 4.5-point favorite. Total on this game I am seeing at 228 on the open. How do you view this? Because I know that you're relatively high on the Thunder, and I have come around on this team as well. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, I think, is once again going to be the best player out there on the floor, and with the Minnesota Timberwolves, should have Rudy Gobert back, but no doubt this is a team that has been dealing with a lot, both on the court and off the court recently.
Yeah, and of course, still no Jaden McDaniels because that hand's broken, no Naz Reid, so you still have some depth issues for Minnesota. So on the surface, look, this looks like a pretty lopsided matchup up front, right? It's Karl-Anthony Towns and it's Rudy Gobert against a front court whose starting center is 6'8". So there's a little bit of a mismatch there when it comes to what the Minnesota Timberwolves are going to match up with down low against the Oklahoma City Thunder. But there's also different ways for the Oklahoma City Thunder to attack this, right? Rudy Gobert out there on the floor. All right, that's fine. Well, we're going to play 5 out, which has bothered Rudy Gobert teams in the past. We're going to force you to guard out in space some of the smaller guys who are able to beat some dudes off dribble penetration, and that's going to go a really long way to us maybe being a little bit more live here in this matchup. And you also look good, Greg, with Rudy Gobert on the floor. If you're looking at transition defense for the Minnesota Timberwolves, off live rebounds, they rank in the 36th percentile of defenses, 123.8 points allowed per 100 plays, and the 39th percentile of qualified lineups at 129 overall. So you're going to see Oklahoma City come out here and try to run this ball up and down the floor and make Gobert uncomfortable. I would say that this Thunder team is going to be pretty live. I think they're very well coached. It's one of the underrated aspects about them. Mark Daigneault's a really freaking awesome coach who's done a lot of stuff with this young roster. And I think this Minnesota Timberwolves team, as you talked about, I mean, you saw it. They've had some trouble with these disjointed starts and stops. The beginning of the New Orleans Pelicans game in the last game of the regular season, or the fourth quarter against the Los Angeles Lakers, in which they go over 6 minutes without a made field goal. Kevin Pelton for ESPN had an incredible stat that over the last 6 minutes of that fourth quarter, Greg, they didn't take a shot closer than 22 feet. Like, that's crazy. They were just taking perimeter shot after perimeter shot, trying to get their shooting group back, and it just wasn't happening. I think that this Thunder team is going to be pretty live here. We'll see what the market does. My guess would be it heads a little bit toward Oklahoma City. When these two teams last met, it was back in January, and it closed OKC at home -2.5. That would represent a little bit more of like a 3.5 point spread. So I would think that the market moves in favor of OKC, but I think the Thunder are going to be pretty live.
I agree with you there, and we are going to be seeing a pair of games on Friday, and you can interject if you'd like, but I don't think whoever pulls out that game in the Eastern Conference is going to be too live against the Milwaukee Bucks. I think that they're facing an uphill battle there, but I think that if the Oklahoma City Thunder are able to get by, they're able to pull off the upset against the Minnesota Timberwolves. Not that they'd be winning the series or anything against the Denver Nuggets, but I think that they would have the potential to be able to win a game or two, because I do think that in whatever series that they're going into, really other than against like the Denver Nuggets, for instance, they are going to have the best player out there on the floor in Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. And even though the Joker is going to have a little bit of an edge just because he does so much, having a guy like Shai just gives you a chance at every game.
So I'll go back to, it's the same category we kind of just talked about, right? To your point, because I agree with you that the Thunder would be very live in that series and just be very pesky, we'll call it, for the Denver Nuggets. Defensive efficiency in transition once again, but this time for Denver. Off of live rebounds, Greg, the Denver Nuggets defending transition off live rebounds. So teams just ripping rebounds and running back up against the Denver Nuggets. 28th in the NBA, 126.6 points per 100 plays allowed, according to Cleaning the Glass. Opponents added 1.4 points per 100 possessions to their offensive rating through transition offense off of live rebounds against Denver. So what does this mean? Well, OKC, one of the top teams in terms of frequency off live rebounds when they want to run, they're going to run, man, and they're going to have success here against Denver. Nikola Jokic, of course, bigger, plotting, kind of like we talked about with Rudy Gobert, not as comfortable getting up and down the floor. The Thunder are going to be just fine doing that and forcing them out of their game and making them really uncomfortable. The Nuggets also suffered defensively. Whenever Aaron Gordon leaves the floor, their defense drops off by quite a bit. I don't think the Nuggets would lose that series, but again, to your point, taking them, they're going to be prohibitive underdog. Taking the Thunder at +2.5 games at what's likely going to be a plus price should they move on. Like, I think that's going to be the way to attack this, because I think you're looking at the Oklahoma City Thunder being quite the pest for the Denver Nuggets because of the way that they match up.
I agree, and John, we'll get you out on this. We've got about 90 seconds for Bulls versus Heat. It's going to be coming up on Friday. The Bulls, they had to pull off that big comeback against the Thunder in order to get here, and right now we're seeing the Heat as a 5-point favorite. How do you view this matchup? Because with the Heat, I still remember I was talking about this team with you about a week or so ago, and we were mentioning defense has been relatively okay for them. Offense has been anemic, and with the Bulls being able to build a little bit of momentum here, I think there might be a little bit of value in the 5 with the Bulls.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And look, I would say this too, Greg. Their defense for the Miami Heat has not been good. If you go back to about middle, I think it's February 14th or so, this team is 22nd in defensive efficiency, and you saw it against the Atlanta Hawks, especially in that first half. They had a defensive rating of 125.5. That's not going anywhere for Miami. And Miami is just flat out overvalued, Greg. I mean, you saw it again in this when they played each other, Miami and Atlanta, back at the beginning of March. That was a 3-point spread in both games in Miami, and yet the market was like, 5.5 at the open here against the Hawks. And we saw what happened. Lost the game outright, and they lost it comfortably. I just think Miami, who now is 30-51-2 against the spread this season, the worst cover team in the NBA, the market has been way too high on them. I would agree with you that I think there's value in Chicago. Chicago, when you look at the way that they play defensively, Alex Caruso and Patrick Beverley are good defensive backcourt. There's a lot of weak pieces in that new starting lineup for Miami. I'd very much rather be on the side of Chicago.
Visit VSiN.com to get current odds, listen for free, find showtimes, and download VSiN sports betting podcasts.